Western Australia would seem to be experiencing a new gold rush. Is this the beginning of a new era for that part of the country? It coincides, of course, with the recent record highs for the price of the precious metal itself. Let's talk now to Empire Metals Chief Executive Mike Struthers, who joined us now from Portugal. Mike, good to talk to you. I know that Empire Metals has just moved further into Western Australia with the purchase of a company called Eclipse. Give us some more details about what it is that you're doing at Empire Metals.
Yes, hi. Good to be with you, Jeremy. Yes, we had the joint venture we have in Georgia started in 2015, and that's been a long road that people who followed us would be familiar with. But we've been looking for new opportunities for probably about a year or so now. And at the beginning of this year, we decided to cast the net somewhat wider. A number of us in Empire have got connections, past connections in Australia. Our CFO is an Australian, in fact. Some of the other board members have been involved with projects. I lived and worked there for 10 years. So we cast the net out to Australia as well through connections, and initially did a deal on a palladium project called Money. But the joint venture in Australia on that project hit some bumps, so that's still on hold, still pending for us. But then we came across Eclipse, and it's an interesting old gold mining camp. The resurgence in Australia now is, off the back of really elevated gold prices. A lot of these old mining camps are getting looked at again, and Eclipse has got a couple of old shafts, all fairly shallow, down about 50, 80 meters or so. But we like the look of it, so we took an option on it, initially 6 months, and actually exercised the option early, and did our own field work, liked the look of it, showed some expansions at depth and on strike and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, it's an interesting start for us in a new jurisdiction.
Okay, I want to take a look into more detail about Western Australia in just a minute. I want to bring up a share price because I think it's right to talk about the context of this, because you mentioned Georgia Mining, as the company was. And just before we came to air on this, you and I were talking about this drop that you had. This goes back to, I think, around about the beginning of the time when you were involved in Empire Metals, and you were faced with this steep drop in the share price. You mentioned Georgia, the copper. It's a well-trodden story for many who will know the background to your company. But just quickly outline what happened here, and then we'll get on to where we are on the share price at the moment. Just explain what went on.
Well, as the graph shows, I mean, back in 2017 or so, the company was a 20+ million pound market cap junior. And, as I say, the joint venture, which started in 2015, was going quite well. The company had done a couple of years of field work, made some new discoveries. The land package in Australia that Georgian Mining and now Empire holds is a large slug of the country. It's over 1% of Georgia. Very prospective, a highly prospective copper gold epithermal terrain. And within the license area, there are half a dozen named projects, and then a large greenfield tract of land, very prospective. But everything looked good when I joined. But shortly after that, it became apparent that the company was facing some political challenges in Georgia, mostly around some exploration permits that needed to be extended. Another period of time, an extension of a few years, and some issues with the partners, which can be challenging too in those sorts of jurisdictions. So, what really became a story of political interference and delay brought the company's fieldwork to a halt. We were no longer able to operate, and it became a long process for me and my colleagues to try to unlock these problems that we had in Georgia. And must be really
frustrating. Must be really frustrating for you, because I mean you can see this metal still there. What's the future of your connection with Georgia Mining and Georgia as a country? Do you see Empire Metals retaining that asset, or is there an option?
There is an opportunity for us. About a month or so ago, a Canadian company, Candelaria Mining, made us an offer to acquire our Georgian assets. They're a company at the moment which is focused on Mexican gold projects. They're about to embark on construction of one of them. But they like the Georgian story, and as a part of the transaction, in fact, I would migrate over to Candelaria Mining as CEO, but I'll maintain my connection with what is now Empire Metals as well. So that transaction is still being discussed. It's on the table from Candelaria, but we are obliged to discuss it with our colleagues in Georgia. Now, there's a 50-50 JV in Georgia, and they have a right of first refusal. So we're involved with them at the moment, discussing whether that transaction, whether they wish to exercise their ROFR or not. If they don't, then the Candelaria transaction will go ahead. But
Okay.
at the moment, Empire, you know, we retain that in.
Yeah. I just want to return, if I can, to the share price as things stand at the moment at 3.4 pence. It's London listed stock, of course. Just wanted to ask you, the question is, if you were to unlock this Georgian asset, in other words, if Empire Metals was to go and then concentrate its exposure in the goldfields in Western Australia, which is, I know, what you want to try and do through Eclipse, do you see that as a point of uplift for shares? I mean, what's priced in at 3.5 pence at this level? You've already raised the £2 million to finalise this deal to acquire Eclipse, which I assume is now plain sailing to go through with the deal completely. So you have, in essence, an asset then which is based on this record high gold price.
That's absolutely right, and the majority, in fact, I would say all of the recent placings in the company, the last fundraiser that you mentioned, is all off the back of this Eclipse project in Australia. That's driving the interest in the stock at the moment. We retain this interest in Georgia, but the story that people are investing in at the moment is our opportunities with Eclipse in Australia. The fact that we can develop
happening
that
in Western Australia. What's happening in Western Australia precisely? Because I mean, the whole of this year has been a really good rise in the price of gold, and we saw a number of gold companies that already produce the metal soar on the back of it. We know the reasons why. What is it about Western Australia, first of all? I mean, this is an old gold mining district. What's happened that's struck it again in terms of interest?
I think I mean, you're right. And in fact, the first gold rush, really was in the mid-19th century in Australia. It's got a long history of gold mining, and particularly in Western Australia. But look, I think predominantly it's the gold price. It's made a lot of these old mining areas attractive once again. In Australian dollar terms, we're looking at $2,500 to $2,700 an ounce. So record gold prices for in recent times, and that really is driving a lot of interest in what were abandoned mining areas, things that have been looked at or explored before but never really developed because of depressed prices. Now it's looking attractive. It's challenging, of course, because everybody and his dog is active in Australia. It's pretty hard to get drill rigs and very hard to find geologists, etc. And because of COVID, of course, a lot of the borders are closed, so they rely on the migration of people and equipment across the states to feed these mini booms, and that's just not happening. So all rigs and all geologists in Western Australia are very busy at the moment. But I think these prices have allowed people to come back and look at areas that just weren't economic before. We're fortunate.
Talking about. I was going to say, talking about the economic side of the deal, how much easier is it now? You mentioned the fact that this region really started back in the early 19th century. Clearly, technology has moved on a lot since then. How much easier is it now to pull what gold is left in the ground there because of new technologies?
Much easier, of course. The recoveries that we can achieve these days with processing technologies are much better than they were in those days. So, both from a mining and from a process perspective, there's, the cut-off grades that we can apply now to make something, which makes something economic or not, are much lower than they obviously used to be. In the Eclipse project area, there's actually been real gold nuggets found on surface in part of that license area. So From a process perspective, that actually makes it really easy. But you know, we're able to apply much lower cut-off grades now, and Eclipse has got the potential to not just be a shallow open pit, but also to have extensions that may be an underground mine as well in the future. So look, it's a much easier to revisit these old areas now with new technologies and with current prices. Yeah, and that's really driving this interest now.
Okay, so let's assume the whole deal goes through. We know that it's all looking like it's all going to be fine. What about the future then for Eclipse? What's down the pipe on this? Because you still haven't got to a point where you're producing, of course.
No, I mean, we'll focus our efforts on Eclipse. Empire will develop Eclipse. We expect to see a lot of progress in Q1 of next year. We'll be back in there doing more drilling, develop resources, etc., and we'll evaluate, you know, a shallow open pit operation and the potential for an underground. So we'll focus our efforts on Eclipse. Empire, though, will be looking at other opportunities both around the immediate surrounds of Eclipse, but also, you know, elsewhere in Western Australia. It's a very good time. There's a lot of competition, of course, but it's a good time for us to build on a presence in Western Australia now. So that'll be our focus also in the early part of next year, to see how we can build on that story. In the background, we've still got, you know, this Georgian possibility as well, the transaction with Canada. So we'll see how that, from Empire's perspective, we'll see how that works out. I mean, we'll either come away from that with a stake in a Canadian listed company, or with a cash transaction that we'll do with our partners as a part of their right of first refusal. So that'll be good news for Empire, whichever way it goes, and give us more momentum to build on what we have in Australia.
Yeah, one final question is, I know that you have come from the mining industry as opposed to an investor or a banker or a numbers man. Just wanted to reference the price of gold if we possibly can. I'll bring up a chart on this. I mean, you know the chart very well. We're currently trading at something like around about $1,880 an ounce. What are your thoughts on the price of gold? I mean, first of all, what's driven it to these highs? The second question is what's 2021 looking like for the price of gold?
Well, I think gold is almost like it's a separate currency. You know, it's a backup currency when the world economy, and with all the impacts of COVID, uncertainty around the situation in the States with the elections, challenges, of course, with, you know, in Europe with Brexit and et cetera, et cetera. All of this instability tends to feed the gold price. I think that gold is going to remain very strong for 21. I think it's going to stay up at these levels, possibly even go a little bit higher during the course of 21. So beyond that, who knows? But I'm confident that gold is going to stay strong during the next year. So I think we're going to continue to see 1800 plus for the foreseeable. Of course, you know, the change in government, change in leadership in the States, and hopefully starting to see some good news on the COVID front will improve outlooks a bit. But I think gold's going to stay strong.
Look, Mike, it's a pleasure. Thanks indeed for catching up with us and your time there in Portugal. And we'll look forward to more news as it develops into 2021. And do join us again, because I'd like to get an update on how things are developing, not just in Western Australia, but also in the assets as well in Georgia. That's Mike Struthers. He's the Chief Executive of Empire Metals.